All right, so what we have now next is we're going to go over the operation and things to do with the chop saw slash miter saw. We mostly call it a chop saw, which is this guy right here. Another really, I'd say, second or even most common big power tool in any shop, really. Ours is a DeWalt brand here. You can see it's a lot. The setup, the actual tool part, it's mounted on a base here. But it is a lot smaller than a table saw, and it can do a lot of the same things. We can't do as big material, but once we rip our material down to kind of the process here when we build things in the shop, as we rip things down potentially to a certain width, or it comes in the width we need it to, and we can cut. Mostly what we're going to do on a chop saw is cutting stick goods. So the type of materials you can do on this, same thing with table saw and with most of the wood side here in the shop that we're in, is doing wood, plastic, foam. It can also do aluminum. So non-ferrous type of material, again, you'll go over types of materials in the lecture portion, but it can also do aluminum as well. We don't do it that often. Most of the time, again, we're building a lot out of wood. We've got some other saws meant for doing like metal and aluminum as well. But it can do, again, wood, plastic, foam, aluminum. The thing, so marking and measuring this, I'll go over that first to get your piece mark, because that's kind of the steps when you're going to go to cut something on this, and then we'll go over operation. So unlike the table saw where we have that fence and guide that kind of measure for us that we can slide back and forth and not really think about using a tape measure, what we're going to need most of the time for this, for the chop saw, is to mark our piece out with a tape measure and pencil, pen, whatever you want to use. So when marking a piece, whenever you're cutting through something, there's a thickness to the blade, right? So that material is going to be taken away. So when we go to mark something, we come over here and we need to mark something to about 1 foot, whatever it is. What I do, make a little tick mark there, right on 1 foot. And so this left side here is the piece that we want to be 1 foot or close to it, as close as we can get it, right? This other side is like our cutoff side. And what we'll do as a reminder for that a lot of times, the process of things whenever we're building in the shop and we can actually have more people in here, if we have like a team, and what we do a lot with the Intro to Tech course, it is maybe like 3 people to a cut list, getting a drawing and things like that, and going through and cutting things like what we're going to be doing here. But someone can maybe mark out all your pieces. What's really helpful is putting an X on the side we know is the side that we don't want. What that gives the person of whoever's cutting, whether it's yourself or someone else, is that the blade is going to be set just ever so slightly to the side with the X on it. Again, because if you cut right on that line, what we can also do is take our speed square if we want. You don't have to necessarily, but we mark a line there. And you want your blade, if you cut right on that line, your potential will be, half or the thickness of the blade will be that much shorter. Is it just gonna be like 1/8 or so, or 1/16 short? Yes, but we wanna try and be as accurate as we can in the shop. So do your best to kind of, and it just comes with practice of kind of getting good at that. That's kind of the basis of marking tools out, or marking material out to cut on the chop saw. It'll also tie into the radial arm saw as well. Cool. So next is kind of operation and the type of blade that's on the chop saw. Didn't touch super in depth on the type of blade when we did the table saw. Well, that's going to get into, and what we'll see more of an example of a different type of blade that's meant for rip cuts is on the radial arm saw. The chop saw we have here, and you see this is the tool guard here. I can lift it up by hand. It also will get an operation, it moves out of the way on its own, but I can lift it up. You can see the blade here, if you notice on the table saw, it looks very similar in terms of design. So this is a very common kind of general purpose layout, which means it can cover a lot of different types of material in the shop, but it is generally meant for doing when general purpose can do multiple cuts. I mentioned on the table saw that is really meant for doing rip cuts. You'll see with like a cross cut, there's more blades there. And it gets into some of the technicalities of like the gullets and size of teeth and spacing there, of like keeping sawdust out, and it really gets into how your cut looks and not getting into chipping and clean cuts and that. We're not as concerned about that in theater. We're in kind of like slapping things together a bit, but like finer woodworking and things, if you're getting into that, you start to get more into that, because that becomes more important if you're into furniture making or whatever. It really gets down into different types of blades. But anyway, so here's the blade that's on it. I mentioned stick goods. So like 1x4, 2x4 is what we do a lot on here. I have some OSB plywood and some actual 1x6 here and some 2x4 that we can cut. It can do all these. So stick goods, we don't have our shelves super stocked right now, but usually what's great right in front of the chop saw and the radial arm saw, which is just down from this, is right on the shelves, is having your stick goods stacked up here. You know, we can hold a whole lot of material up here and stack 2x4 and 1x4, which are probably the most common stick goods that come in all kinds of lengths, depending on, like, you know, if you're framing walls, you're using 2x4 or whatever, doing flats that you'll learn about, and doing 1x4 out of those. So that's where we really utilize the chop saw. So operation, I mentioned back, you know, that where to stand and put your hands is really important. Keeping your hands at a safe distance and all that. So with this one, as you come up to the chop saw, it is not like turn it on and it turns the blade on and it stays on. It's trigger operated. So up on the handle up here that I have my right hand on, if I let go of that switch as I hold it, then it's going to turn the blade off. So part of this is holding that power button down the whole time as you're cutting through your piece. Another part of this is movement here. There's just more steps with the chop saw as compared to like the table saw. So there's a sliding feature with this one that slides out. So we can do pretty, you know, fairly wide pieces, like up to 1 foot or so on the chop saw. So that slides all the way out. We come down into our piece and then slide into it. Cool. You could lock this off and just cut straight down into something. I like to tell people to kind of get in the habit of sliding out, because if you are doing a wide piece, then in order to cut through your whole piece, you have to slide out. And it's just kind of what it is meant as far as the operation of this. So again, slide, I'm holding the trigger, I'm pushing down all the way. You know, if you ever use this, don't be worried about like cutting through the base. Like, there's a limit on it. You want to push all the way down so you know your blade's all the way through. As I mentioned, the tool guard just moves out of the way on its own and then all the way through. Once you cut through your piece, you can let go of the power button and then come back up. Cool. So as I'm standing here, we can't just put one hand on this and do it. You know, we need to be holding down our piece as well. So as that blade's spinning, it kind of wants to take that piece with it, right? So we need to hold on to it pretty tight with our left hand here. You know, you can do this left-handed if you wanted to. I'm going to do it right-handed, and we would just be switching hands here and standing in a different spot probably. You want to have a good vision where you can see your line and be lined up. So what we're going to do, once we marked our piece, as an example, we got this piece of OSB here. So length of pieces you should be cutting on this. Generally, at least 1 foot to 16 inches. You can see here that this is spanning all the way to our bench here. So we've got this awesome bench, and just like the fence on the table saw that slides, this is kind of a backing fence on the chop saw. So we've got that to press against. So it's the same thing with the table saw that was kind of had the four fingers on top and thumb in front. This I'm going to have with my left hand, thumb in front still, and then 4 fingers down. It's going to be kind of the same thing of pressure, push down and back towards the fence as well. Same thing with the table saw. You don't want any gap here. If you turn it there, it's going to make an angle in your cut and potentially bind on the blade, you know, and have that kickback that we mentioned. Not near as often that happen on like a chop saw, but again, tight to the fence to make your cut accurate, and then cut all the way through. Some other features with the chop saw that are special that we can do. The reason it's also called a miter saw is we can do angles. So like you would do this maybe with like trim in your home that's got pretty crown molding and angles and stuff in it. So we've got this little lever here, and there's a bunch of notches. We can come a little closer and maybe see that there's numbers here on the base that we can slide and rotate this on. to know which angle we're at, left or right, we've got this red little arrow here, and that tells us where we're at. So when we're straight here, just like on the table saw, you can kind of see on the side here, and maybe, that it says 0. So that's our 90 or 0, cool? And when you're there, you want to lock this black lever down, lift up on that to turn it. There's a button you can press too. And you might hear that clicking. There's all these notches here for really common angles. So like 45 being one, it'll lock in there. Say we need 47 or something like that in between, you can do that too. You're just going to be in between one of these notches, and you really want to be sure to lock the lever back down. You want to do that either way. So at 45, I would lock that down, and we can cut a 45-degree angle. Another thing to watch out for is the fence backing here on the actual saw itself. Those can be adjusted as well. There's little knobs in the back to slide those, but generally we're going to be sure you notice that you're not cutting through, which we aren't on this cut if we were doing that. Same general thing of holding your hands, a little more awkward of where you have to look potentially, so think about that if you're ever doing angles. We're going to come back to 0. If you do angle cuts on something, just kind of be courteous and set it back to 0 when you're done with it, especially if you were doing maybe like a 1, 2, 3 degree angle or something like that. Another angle adjustment is we can go left and right on the blade itself. So we can do like a compound miter cut. We could have, that gets into trim things that we're not doing again as often as just plain straight cuts, but it is an option we have. So we could do that. Just like on the base here, we won't zoom in on this and look at it, but there is a gauge on the back here and notches that you can set it to tilt this left and right and lock it in. So there's that. The lever that's for that, to loosen that, to pop it, is here on the back. So to get back to 0, it'll lock there. So that's back at 0. So a couple of little extra adjustments there to know about. On the base itself here, we've got some hand symbols like don't put your hands here. That's their recommendation. We would try to keep that as much as possible. Most of the time, again, we're doing long pieces here. If you got to do something that's that short, just again, try and keep track of where your hand's at a safe distance. It's about 8 inches to a foot away from the blade. You do not be cutting something that's only we have an example sitting out here, but something that's really short, right? If you're trying to cut a little scrap piece, like say we cut this off and we have a little tiny piece and you need something really tiny, don't be trying to cut something that small. And I mean, that just put your hand really close. What's going to happen, you probably won't be able to hold on to that piece, and the blade's going to take that piece and sling it away from you or whatever. So just be smart and use common sense. And when you're cutting something, and think about it. There are other ways. If we need to cut really small things like that, we can use different type of saw that's safer to use to do more detailed things and tinier things like that. So we'll do an actual cut here real quick. So again, where my hands are, body, right hand on the top, left hand down here. When you go to set this, so we made a mark on this one. What you'll normally do, we marked our piece. This is kind of where measure twice, cut once saying that you might have heard. So we measured to start with. We're going to come in. I'm not even going to turn on the saw yet. I'm going to place where it needs to be because we don't have that locking down fence like we do on the table saw. I'm going to come down. I'm going to check that my blade's just a hair to the right on the X side, right? Come down, check it, and I'm going to come back up, reset, then I'm going to make my cut. I would have already, before that, probably put my safety glasses and ear protection on. Same things required for safety for this one. So I'm going to start the blade before doing the cut, right? So starting up top. Well, once I cut through, I let go of the power button and came up. You can kind of maybe tell by the speed. You don't want to be too slow. You don't want to be too fast. Kind of just a smooth speed in there. For the shorter people, potentially, it gets a little trickier maybe as you're coming. It's maybe a little more awkward. It's definitely helpful when you're taller. You can kind of be more on top of the saw. But it's a little, again, more coordination moving with this and a little something more to get used to if you ever get to use one for in person. So that's kind of the operation. I want to do a couple more cuts, just maybe you can kind of hear and feel the difference. So like when we're doing something thicker like this, 2x4, it can be a little nasty sometimes. It's got knots in it and potentially, and it can get a little twisty. So when you're doing something like that with any wood and cutting things, there's the potential, like, things getting in your way, making it harder to cut through. I just want to mention that so that you're aware of it, get used to it. We're just going to lop off a little end here. Maybe you can kind of hear a little bit of a difference in the 2x4 that we're going to cut. So I'll do one more cut. And I don't have a mark on this one, so I'm just going to cut straight through it. So, maybe you can tell and hear the difference a little bit in that. As far as also dust collection with this one, I'll admit that the dust collection at our radial arm saw and chop saw aren't the best compared to like the table saw, but it does have a vent at the back, and we try and turn that on. We came over when the table saw and showed you guys where that was at. So there is that. Some other things around here we try to keep organized with like scrap pieces. So like when we get small pieces like this that you don't need, those are generally trash. It's not super useful. But little ones like this we might keep, and we throw in a little bin below there. We've also got scrap goods here, pieces on the right here, as far as like layout and things. So I think that covers most of it for the chop saw. On to the next one.